Imagine a world where rivers, lakes, and seas were not just sources of life and trade routes, but also merciless executioners claiming victims daily. A world where anyone submerged for more than a few minutes was considered irretrievably lost. Death by drowning was commonplace, a part of the everyday landscape, an unavoidable end against which traditional medicine was utterly powerless. Doctors shrugged their shoulders, citing divine will or unchangeable laws of nature. There were no protocols, no rescue methods, only despair and resignation to fate. At a time when drowned bodies were recovered from the water and buried without question, and official science saw no point in resuscitation attempts, something began to change. Not in the dusty offices of renowned professors, nor within the walls of prestigious academies where ancient dogmas and authorities reigned. Instead, change emerged in the most unexpected places, in the minds of those who witnessed this tragedy daily and refused to accept it as inevitable. These were apothecaries who understood chemistry and the properties of substances better than many doctors. They were merchants, accustomed to risk and innovation in trade, and they were simple fishermen and boatmen whose lives depended on the water and who too often saw it claim their comrades. They were the ones who began to act. They experimented with methods that seem primitive today, but were then the only hope, blowing air into lungs using bellows or tubes, attempting to warm bodies by rubbing them or burying them in warm ashes, even using tobacco smoke as a stimulant. They lacked academic degrees, but possessed an invaluable quality, they observed. They collected data, albeit unsystematized, who survived, who didn't, under what conditions, and which actions helped. They shared their observations, formed early interest groups, and exchanged letters, trying to find some pattern. It was an informal, scattered movement, driven by a single, indomitable desire to save lives. From this chaos of trial and error, from this indomitable desire to help, and from this empirical pursuit, something grand was born, the Humane Society. It became a beacon in a sea of ignorance and prejudice. It transformed into a powerful, centralized organization that systematized fragmented knowledge, developed standardized resuscitation protocols, and trained volunteers nationwide. The Society published brochures, compiled statistics, established rescue stations along rivers and seas, and distributed specialized equipment. It became a symbol that even in the face of seemingly inevitable death, humanity could fight and triumph. The result of this undertaking, unprecedented in its scope? Thousands, then tens of thousands, of lives saved. The Humane Society didn't just rescue drowning victims, it changed society's perception of death and life, proving that resuscitation was possible. It laid the fundamental principles for all modern emergency medicine, for ambulance systems, and for the cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, we know today. This was more than just a breakthrough, it was a genuine revolution in understanding the limits of the human body and its potential for recovery. Here we arrive at one of the most important lessons of this story, a lesson that fundamentally refutes the common romanticized myth of scientific progress. We tend to think that great discoveries result from a sudden epiphany by a lone genius, working in isolation, detached from the world. We imagine science advancing thanks to solitary visionaries who, in a moment of brilliant insight, invent something entirely new. The history of the Humane Society presents a completely different picture. It demonstrates that progress is not a flash but a slow, painstaking, often agonizing accumulation of experience. It is the result of collective effort, countless trials and errors from which lessons were learned. It is not elegant theoretical constructs, but gritty practical work on the brink of life and death based on observation and verification. It is not fleeting inspiration, but perseverance, methodical practice, and a willingness to learn from failures. This was the work of apothecaries who knew the chemistry and physiology of the human body better than any professor and applied this knowledge in practice. It was the work of merchants who knew how to organize resources and disseminate information with an efficiency unavailable to state institutions. And it was the work of simple fishermen who saw death every day and sought ways to outwit it, relying on experience rather than authority. It was these unlearned and unofficial researchers who created what official medicine of the time considered impossible, and what later became the basis for saving millions of lives. How exactly they did this, what specific methods they used, and what incredible obstacles they faced from ignorance and conservatism, that is the next chapter of our story. For centuries, medicine remained a captive of archaic doctrines, bound by the chains of dogma and blind reverence for the past. It was not the art of healing, but a strict adherence to ancient texts written a millennium and a half earlier. Doctors, more often armchair philosophers than practicing healers, relied on the infallible authority of Galen and Hippocrates, ignoring direct observation of the human body. Illness was considered a consequence of an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This principle, known as humoral theory, dictated the entire approach to treatment. It amounted to attempts to restore a perceived balance through mindless bloodletting, debilitating emetics, and aggressive laxatives. Patients were not treated for specific ailments, they were brought into balance, often to the point of complete exhaustion or death. The dying process itself was perceived as a natural, fated stage, rather than a failure of medical intervention. In this world where logic yielded to dogma and experience was rejected in favor of ancient maxims, medical methods were often more destructive than the ailments themselves. Open wounds, whether from a sword or an accident, were cauterized with red-hot irons or had boiling oil poured into them. Surgeons believed this prevented infection, though it only exacerbated the injury and shock. Pus, flowing abundantly from wounds, was called laudable, a sign that the body was cleansing itself of harmful humors. No one understood that this was a sure sign of deadly infection, leading to sepsis and inevitable demise. Surgeries, if performed, were an unbearable torture. Without anesthesia, without the slightest concept of antisepsis, they almost always ended in agonizing death from pain, shock, or infection. The human body remained an unsolved mystery. Its internal workings were not a subject of study, but a taboo consecrated by tradition. Death in this context was not an enemy to be conquered, but an inevitable, often accelerated end, brought about by the healer's interventions. Any attempt to deviate from these established practices, any doubt in the authority of ancient texts or ecclesiastical dogmas, any suggestion to observe and experiment, was considered a dangerous heresy, a threat to the entire world order. Progress wasn't just slowed, it was halted by a system that preferred blind faith over empirical inquiry. This stagnation prevented not only the rescue of drowning victims, whose fate seemed predetermined, but also any meaningful combat against illness, be it a simple fever or a fatal wound. It was in this atmosphere of intellectual stagnation and practical impotence, where knowledge was confined to old books and bold experimentation was scorned, that the first sparks of a new practical medicine began to emerge, a medicine that dared to view humans not as a collection of imbalanced fluids, but as a complex yet studiable mechanism that could and should be saved using reason and observation. One of those who did not resign himself to this world order was a young apothecary from London named William Hawes. He was not a physician whose diplomas would have obligated him to follow Galen's dogmas. He was a practitioner whose hands daily touched medicines, chemical reagents, and the human body. An apothecary, unlike the armchair physicians, knew how substances interacted and how they affected the body. He understood physiology not from ancient treatises, but from his own experience, from thousands of mixed powders and tinctures. And he saw death. He saw it not only in the waters of the Thames, but also in the stuffy wards of London hospitals, where those who might still be saved were brought. There, within those walls, William Hawes observed medical powerlessness in its stark reality. He saw patients weakened by fever bled half to death, attempting to restore the balance of mythical humors. He saw open wounds cauterized with red-hot irons, leaving behind charred flesh and unbearable pain, which often killed faster than the disease itself. He heard doctors speak proudly of laudable pus, not realizing it was a harbinger of imminent agony. Death here was not a failure, but an inevitable end, accepted with fatalism. These scenes deeply affected him. He could not understand why human reason was not being used to find real solutions, why experience, which could be accumulated and analyzed, was ignored in favor of long outdated theories. Doctors, respected members of society, followed a pattern established over centuries, but this pattern led only to suffering and death. William Hawes saw this every day. He saw people dying who, in his inner conviction, could be saved if only someone dared to deviate from accepted rules. His professional path as an apothecary, constantly dealing with the material world and the specific effects of chemical compounds on living organisms, gave him a unique perspective. He did not believe in abstractions, he believed in action and results. When he saw a body pulled from the water showing no signs of life, he did not rush to despair. He did not see it as divine will, but merely a temporary cessation of functions that might be restored. This young man, whose education was practical rather than academic, began to ask questions no one dared to voice. What if death is not a period, but merely a comma? What if one could not simply resign oneself, but fight for every breath, for every heartbeat? These questions, these doubts, born within hospital walls against a backdrop of widespread hopelessness, became a spark that would soon ignite a flame of change that would sweep across Europe and alter humanity's very attitude towards life and death. William Hawes was ready for this struggle. He was ready for a quest that would lead him and his like-minded colleagues to create something truly revolutionary. William Hawes did not wait, he acted. His laboratory became the damp, muddy banks of the Thames, and his patients were those whom the relentless current washed ashore. He knew that every second counted. Death by drowning, according to most, was irreversible after just a few minutes. But Hawes, the apothecary, believed otherwise. He observed how some bodies, recovered from the water, retained a spark, a faint potential for life. He noticed that even after prolonged submersion, a warm body might respond to external stimuli. This was not a miracle, it was an observation. He always carried a bag with the simplest remedies, vials of warming tinctures, woolen cloths, candles, and rubbing oil. These methods were primitive, but sometimes they yielded results, though not always. He rubbed limbs, tried to warm cooling bodies by a fire, and poured warm liquids into mouths. But one day, after several futile attempts to revive another victim of the river, his supplies ran out. The oil was gone. The cloths were soaking wet. Night was approaching, bringing with it an icy wind. Helplessness enveloped him, but he refused to give up. In that moment of despair, he recalled something he had seen in villages. Healers sometimes tried to revive unconscious animals by blowing air into their nostrils. He remembered how blacksmiths used bellows to fan coals, making embers burst into bright flames. What if breathing was not just the movement of air, but a force capable of restarting a stopped mechanism? He had no bellows, but he did have a thin, hollow tube, which he used for mixing powders in his apothecary shop. Without hesitation, Hawes placed it against the nostrils of the man just pulled from the water. He took a deep breath. Gathering all the strength of his lungs, he began to blow air through the tube again and again. Each insufflation was an act of desperate faith. He didn't know what he was doing. He had no scientific basis. There was only an intuitive understanding that the body needed air. He continued, methodically and persistently, blowing air into the motionless man's lungs. Seconds stretched into eternity. Silence. No response. He delivered another deep insufflation. And then, a faint, ragged gasp. The body twitched. A weak but distinct cough escaped the man's mouth. His eyes opened. The man was breathing. Weakly, intermittently, with difficulty, but he was breathing. This was more than just a rescued person. It was the first documented success of mouth-to-nose resuscitation performed in a critical situation. It was the moment when the centuries-old dogma asserting the irreversibility of death by drowning cracked. Hawes proved that death might not be a final point, but merely a temporary state. This discovery, made not within university walls but on cold ground, became a cornerstone for future resuscitation methods. It showed that observation, courage, and a willingness for unorthodox experimentation could overturn perceptions about the boundaries between life and death. That very gasp, that first cough from the drowned man's lungs, was not a miracle to William Hawes. It was confirmation. Confirmation of his bold hunch the human body was not a fragile vessel doomed to perish, but a complex mechanism capable of recovery. From that moment, his approach to rescue became systematic. He didn't just save, he learned. Every life saved, every life lost, every experiment on the banks of the Thames became a lesson for him. Hawes did not possess university credentials, but he wielded the most powerful scientific tool, empiricism. He observed, acted, analyzed the results, and adjusted his methods. Why did some survive while others didn't? What duration underwater was critical? Which actions provided the most benefit? He did not seek answers in ancient tomes, he sought them in practice. He recorded his observations, if not in academic journals, then in personal notes and memory. He understood that simply warming the body was not enough. That rubbing, though important for stimulating circulation, would not replace the primary need, breathing. He saw how feeble attempts to restore warmth often yielded no results if the lungs remained without air. It was this experience, accumulated over hundreds of attempts, that led him to conclude the foremost task was to restore breathing. But personal experience alone was not enough. Knowledge confined to one person's mind could not change the world. William Hawes, as an apothecary, understood the mechanism of dissemination perfectly. He knew how to convey information to the general public. Therefore, he began to publish his observations and instructions, not in Latin, the language of scholars and the elite, but in plain, understandable English. This was revolutionary. He made knowledge accessible to every fisherman, boatman, and ordinary citizen. His brochures contained not only case descriptions, but also clear, step-by-step instructions, how to pull someone from the water, how to clear the airways, how to blow air. He wasn't just writing, he was creating the first resuscitation protocols written for the people. Furthermore, Hawes realized that improvised means were not always effective. The thin tube that saved the first life was a fortunate accident, but mass rescue required specialized tools. So he began to design them. These were simple devices, special tubes for introducing air into the lungs, more effective than apothecary ones, kits for rubbing and warming, even designs for transport. He wasn't reinventing the wheel, he was refining existing ideas, making them suitable for emergency aid. He thought like an engineer, applying his practical knowledge of chemistry and physics to saving human lives. He was not afraid of mistakes. He regarded every failure as a valuable lesson that brought him closer to the truth. If one method didn't work, he analyzed why and tried another. This methodical approach, this tireless pursuit of perfection in a constant struggle against death and ignorance, became his primary weapon. He was not a genius who received a flash of insight. He was a persistent practitioner who, step by step, paved the way to rescue, transforming the chaos of despair into systematized knowledge. His successes on the Thames, his bold instructions written for everyone, could not go unnoticed. But recognition did not come from where it was expected. It did not originate from the halls of the Royal College of Physicians. On the contrary, the medical establishment, confined within its world of ancient treatises, met his work with disdain. To them, Hawes was an upstart, an apothecary who dared to invade the sacred domain of their profession. Doctors, whose training was based on 1,500-year-old dogmas, saw his methods not as salvation, but as a dangerous encroachment. How could a person without a diploma, who had not passed through the crucible of academic debates, propose something new? They called his artificial respiration barbaric, unworthy of a civilized person. They asserted that blowing air into the lungs of the dead was not only meaningless but blasphemous, an attempt to deceive Providence. For death, in their conviction, was a final verdict, not a state from which one could escape. Moreover, they insisted that the body of a drowned person was irreversibly filled with water, and any attempts to insufflate air would only worsen their condition, damaging internal organs. This was a false but deeply entrenched belief, reinforced by centuries of ignorance. They didn't just criticize, they acted. Doctors wrote angry letters to local newspapers, warning the public against Hawes's dangerous experiments. They tried to convey their accusations to the city council, demanding a ban on his activities. They spread rumors, calling his methods quackery, and him a fraud who merely indulged his vanity at others' misfortune. Speeches from the rostrums of prestigious educational institutions discredited his practical successes. This was not merely a scientific discussion, it was a struggle for power, for a monopoly on knowledge, for maintaining their social standing, and for the inviolability of their ancient world. But William Hawes also had defenders. They were few, but they possessed one undeniable argument: living people. Those he had pulled from the embrace of the river and death. Fishermen whose comrades had returned to life. Merchants whose families had been saved. These testimonies, these success stories, became Hawes's shield. Among his patrons were not only ordinary people, but also influential figures whose minds were open to new ideas. These included representatives of the merchant class who saw in his work not heresy, but practical benefit, capable of preserving lives and labor and moving the economy. There were also some enlightened members of the nobility who valued results above outdated dogmas and saw in his efforts a genuine manifestation of philanthropy. They did not quote Galen, they pointed to saved lives. They did not refer to ancient texts. They demanded practical verification, posing the challenge: their methods may be unorthodox, they argued, but they work. Show us that your outdated doctrines can save even one life. These patrons provided Hawes with modest funds, ensured his brochures could be published, defended him from press attacks, and even provided venues for demonstrating his methods. They understood that not only the fate of one apothecary was at stake, but also the possibility of changing the world, making it less cruel and more rational. It was thanks to their support, despite the fierce resistance of official medicine, that William Hawes's ideas were not stifled in their infancy. They continued to spread, sowing seeds of doubt in the minds of those who believed in the inevitability of death, and paving the way for the creation of an organized rescue system.